hero, and they're the people who get the credit, whether they're the people who do the work or not. That's the story I want to read, right? And then in Japan, we have something different. It's a different cultural narrative. We have Journey to the West, which we're probably, because of the subsection of people in this room, we're probably also very familiar with the idea of Journey to the West. So Journey to the West is also a story about a real monk that got heavily sensationalized and written over as fiction. And it was a Chinese monk who goes to India. They don't call it that, but he goes to the west of China, goes to India, where Buddhism was founded, and he completes the sacred quest. In the Heian period, which is sort of considered the golden age of Japanese literature, this Journey to the West comes to Japan, and it's rewritten into Japanese story. What's interesting about one of the things that's really big in the change is that in Japan, previously not the primary, but they have animist religions. The one I'm most familiar with is probably Shinto. That's the one that the court now. And the educated people are the people telling these stories. So you have the imperial court in Nara taking the story and they're rewriting it. And they really infuse it with a lot of Shinto belief and virtue. So the biggest cultural change is because Shinto doesn't have morality quite the same way we understand it. And a lot of religions don't. It's a very Judeo-Christian thing, the way we experience morality. Is that the idea of beauty is automatically good. That it is its own virtue and its own sort of subsection of morality. So by making something pretty, you automatically make it good. Like you automatically make it what we would call virtuous and positive. Right? So you can put glitter on something and it goes from being terrible to being amazing. I like glitter. It's an ongoing battle in my house. Anyway, but whereas in the sort of Arthurian legend, which exemplifies and glorifies the lone hero, in Journey to the West we have a hero party, and it glorifies the idea of a hero party where they all interact and they all are revered and they all make contributions to the end, to the final end result. And you could not remove any one of the heroes and still make it to the end. You could not have a successful result. Right? So even in epic fantasy, you might have a party that is questing, but it's really the protagonist who does the work, no matter how stirring the speech that someone makes or what they do. Whereas this is not seen that way, it's a more equitable distribution. So you can see it kind of follows the same pattern, right? You have this real story that one culture heavily influences and makes it into a mythology and a legend. And then it goes, another culture somehow intercepts it, not by conquest of this, but by trade. That's the Heian period Chinese literature and culture was considered the language of the educated, the literature of the educated, of the nobility, much like France was in England, and it's sort of roughly the same time period. So I think that's sort of interesting that you have this influence happening at roughly the same time. And by roughly, I mean like within 200 to 300 years of each other, not like in 1055 for those or 1185 or and then so you have this other culture using that to then inform their future work. So the Heian period was also when Tales of Bamboo Cutter and things were written. This is the time in the era in Japanese history when they arrived from. Immediately after the Heian period, you have a warring state just an interesting difference. Because you don't have that confusion of misogyny for Judeo-Christian, you have it because there's a whole bunch of guys with swords and arrows killing people. You have the same result in a different way. Alright, so you have these cultural narratives, and they again, the journey to the West is sort of the preeminent precursor to everything in Japanese literature, and it's still studied and it's still talked about. And it pulls all these ideas right forward, and you have, I mean, we have so many adaptations of Journey to the West in Japanese literature. It is absolutely bonkers and ridiculous. And you all watch them, because everyone's watched Dragon Ball, or Sayumi, or something like it. Like, you all watch them. So they're very familiar. They really help work. And then clearly they're still being talked about and studied and done, because those are much more recent than 785. All right, so what happened? So as I mentioned, you have the Nara period, you have the evidence of China in that period. So this is also, as I mentioned earlier, this time in Japanese history, this is when things like the Kojiki, which is like the foundation of all Japanese mythology, are written down for the first time. They're way ahead of you. And also, so that was written in 712, and then you also have the Nihon Shogi, which is written in Chinese. Again, Chinese is the language of the educated in Japan at this time. And it's significantly more detailed, but complexes itself, because at that point in time in history, you have a lot of regional differences in Japan. Japan is also not really a country, the way we understand it. Countries are modern things. And you also, go back. Here we go. Just because my fingers are shaking, I need to do that. This is also when Orochimaru gets written down for the first time in 759, and it's a poetry anthology. So, poetry's important. So this is like incredible, and so this all comes forward. Then like you kind of just have these two things existing in the world simultaneously in their own places geographically, bringing the concept, the core beliefs, or whatever you call the underlying fantasy in future world, which is where we live. And what happens in both of these, both ideas, is, as I mentioned, Orochimaru, which is a story that gets retold as a kid's tale, is a poem. And in the 17 and 1800s, what happens in Europe is epic poetry starts getting written a whole lot, and it's sort of the first works of literature that are taken very seriously. They're not fairy tales, they're aimed at adults, to have fantasy themes in them. So in Japan, it's all for adults, and then it gets retold for kids. In England, it's all told for kids, and then all of a sudden people start writing poetry for adults about it. So you have this like switch where all of a sudden everybody's talking about it in both countries, but it does like the opposite kind of switch. And this is so in the 17th and 1800s, you get that the things that become sort of the heart of the fantasy movement, which are things like Edmund Spencer's The Faerie Queen. You have T.S. Eliot writing beautiful works of fantasy. If you really like really great classical fantasy, reading T.S. Eliot and Edmund Spencer is one of the best things you can do for yourself, because it's so much of that heart of what we would really classify fantasy comes out. And then there's some world wars. Like literally this goes up into like the First and Second World War, and this is how we're living. not really. But some medievalists named C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien get in their heads that because the U.S. is going to be venerated, we're going to the world in England and Western Europe is going to become more secular. I have like the expressions I'm making behind my mask. I promise they're exactly what you're thinking. So you have so J.R.R. Tolkien is like, well, we gotta get them while they're young. And C.S. Lewis goes, I agree with you. They're friends. They teach down the hall from each other. They have their viewpoints. They do. They both teach at Oxford. They're like buddies. And you can see it if you go back and you reread their work, knowing they're friends. You're like, oh, yes, I get it. So they write books aimed at kids that tell the story of fantasy and the story that they want people to believe. So I mean, C.S. Lewis just like goes for it, right? Like that's just a Christian allegory, right? That is a Christian allegory retold as fantasy, and he says it like a million times. So I'm not adding anything there. J.R.R. Tolkien's a little more subtle, but they both get really, really popular. And J.R.R. Tolkien he's very deliberately rewriting a myth for the modern English child, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Like the ego you must have. I am going to write the mythology that will save our country's souls. That's what he's doing. I'm not in any way trying to diminish his impact on fantasy fiction. I'm just saying that's what he did. And he did it. Like, it worked. He wrote Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and Silmarillion and all of those, and they have become the definitive model for epic fantasy in all English-speaking countries. Like, good job, sir. Ow. But that's not quite what happens in Japan, largely because yes, like it has a different problem, right? Like, they're not worried about like, well, it might not be the best thing if the U.S. comes in and helps us because we might secularize society. They're like, no, the U.S. is occupying us. And it's so there, you know, you have this huge influence of Western influence of literature on Japan. And there's some really interesting fantasy work that comes out in the 60s out of this amalgamation. And I would really highly recommend Seven Japanese Tales, which was written in 1963. He writes stuff that is like, we would call it, so there's this genre called slipstream, which is like, it's mainstream fiction, but you kind of pull in some fantasy elements or science fiction elements. That's what he's writing. It's not like true fantasy, but he's pulling that in. Partially because Japanese culture never sees a distinguishment between supernatural things and the everyday. They never get to that point culturally. So they write science fiction, they write fantasy, but like almost everything they write is sort of slipstream-ish because there's no distinguishment. There's no delineation between like the fact that there might be like a god in that pond over there. It's very common in the Amazon religion, like right? They use the supernatural to the everyday. And Shinto is still practiced and celebrated for years again. Everyone Shinto, everyone Buddhist, like they don't distinguish between religions because they're like, well, that's silly. Not wrong. But one of the stories in that collection is called A Portrait of Champion, where a young boy wants to become a musician, and he wants to elevate his social standing, as is often the case, and he sort of binds his life verse to that of a musically gifted individual, the daughter in this case, someone of a higher social status. And basically, the story unfolds around the shimasen, which is a traditional Japanese instrument So you can see there's like that super natural element there, like I'm going to make sure that I become attached to the supernatural meanings of this instrument, binding my soul, my life force to it. Okay, so that takes us, that's like really interesting. You have these ideas, you have that idea of, because this makes beautiful, in that you have this idea that like, because the instrument makes beautiful music, nothing else matters. Like, it makes beautiful music. So like, anything that happens in pursuit of that beauty is fine, because beauty is the ultimate good, right? Like that, again, that cohesive sort of came in an infused journey to the West when it came to Japan. So you see it, and then, you know, we see it in some anime. So it's, I mean, Inuyasha is like the perfect example, by the way, of like that tie-in of sort of Western ideology with Japanese ideology to create something really interesting and fun. It ties to Journey to the West. You have the idea of the hero party, because yes, Inuyasha is the titular hero, but like, how many times does Moroku and Sanku say this fun, right? Like, and it's not just like, it's not just lip service, like they genuinely fully contribute to him being successful. In the manga and the anime, before the manga, so does Kagome, she's not real great at the beginning because she never learned to fight, but as she develops more, she becomes more of a fight. And so it's sort of it's also interesting because it goes back in time, so it also pulls forward a whole lot of that folklore and that mythology and things like Nihonshugi and Kochiki, Nihonshugi, sorry. But it puts a modern twist on it. You can really, you see it in the music a lot, by the way. Like, if you ever want to know, listen to the music in anime, it tells you a lot about the story. I really also just like this picture of Moroku fletching after a snow Zelda. It's saying. So you have this modern fantasy, and then there is some, it's a quest story, which also is part of Journey to the West. That's what, as I said, that's what the part is. But Journey to the West is a quest story too. You're questing for an ideal instead of a tangible object. That's a very important distinction between the two questing mythologies. You also have Dragon Ball, which is one of our lovely modern retellings of Journey to the West. This is just Journey to the West retold. The main characters have the same names. They have the same sort of character types. Akira Toriyama told a like pseudo sci-fi version of Journey to the West with dragons. You have Yu Yu Hakusho. This is one where it's a questing fantasy, but the type of quest is for redemption, especially in the early part of the series, of course. Later on, it's for power and glory and all the fun things. But in the beginning, he's like, I should not have done those bad things. Let me redeem myself. So that idea that it's still a quest, but the quest is for an ideal as opposed to a tangible object, is much more, and definitely pulled itself from Journey to the West. A different perspective about it. Also, this idea of, again, a hero party where they all do something that's very necessary. Not just Kuwabara dying, of course, but all the other things. They become very necessary, and you need to have all of them. Also, sort of the character oaths of like, you have this like rough and tumble thug, you have somebody who's sort of an entity, you have someone who has lots of different layers, you have someone who's sort of a spiritual bodyguard. All of those are odes to the main character composition of Journey to the West. And you have this stuff, there we go. We have this stuff in the US and England. And then you see how this is modern, right? Like, we talked about how King Arthur leads right up to this. But concepts like the Galadriel, this King Arthur is worthy to wield Excalibur, because it was an oral legend, so there's lots of different versions of King Arthur. So all of that stuff, and that idea of like being destined, being special somehow, all of that pulls in the Lord of the Rings and informs modern fantasy, but it comes originally from Arthurian legend. I mean, Thor pulls right from Norse mythology. It's in the title. But it does depend, of course, on which comic you read. But things like Mjolnir, all of that comes directly from Norse. That comes directly from Norse mythology. In some of the comics, like they do have the pantheon, the Norse pantheon. You also have there's references in some of the comics to just things like ravens being blind, which is a direct tie-in to Odin and his ravens who gather knowledge and memory. And then something a little different, but is a Durval still. So this is A Dream of Eagles, the one that this series is a retelling of King Arthur. Jack White is he's a historian by training, and he retold King Arthur sort of a modern fantasy that takes a look at some of the history that we actually know around King Arthur and includes it in the fantasy. It's a really interesting retelling. It ties directly into Arthurian legend, but it still has some of the tropes and things that we get from Tolkien. With how we use characters and the predominance of sort of that lone questing hero. I do think what's interesting about the Skystone is that the Skystone starts with the character who's supposedly the inspiration for Merlin. So like that's where the story starts. That's actually what the Skystone's all about. He's a smith and a meteor falls to Earth and he makes a sword out of it. And that's like the rise of the character Merlin. So this is just a modern retelling that includes, again, some of what we know historically, which is sort of an interesting idea to move away from the mythical, legendary King Arthur and into a modern history base. But it also uses, like I said, the tropes from Tolkien, luckily without some rampant racism. And now what we're getting is we're getting these things that are, because information is moving between everywhere so quickly, and we're having more and more cultural confusion, and people in the US are buying things from Japan, and people in Japan are buying things from the US, and things are getting translated, and people are living in those countries. You're getting stories that look at both. And I think we're getting this culmination of we had these very similar pathways from groups that had very different stories, and then you can still tell them, even though maybe actually yes has some Western influence. It's a very Japanese story. It's literally an introduction to the Shinto religion, by the way. It literally is a primer of Shinto religion. It's fascinating. You have people who are writing in both and are trying to write stories that deliberately use not just sort of the clothing of the other culture, right? It's not like an American story where they have to wear kimono and kama, but you actually try to tell a story that is in a non-appropriating sort of way. Whether that is someone who is Japanese writing a story for a US audience, or whether that is someone like Brandon Sanderson, who lived in Asia for many years and wrote The Emperor's Soul while he was living there. And I include this one because a lot of my friends from Asia are like, no, he actually did it right. Like, a lot of these other ones are terrible, but the Emperor's Soul is really good, and like, you should actually read it. Which, don't hate me, but I don't like Brandon Sanderson, so I haven't done that. I know, whenever I tell somebody who likes fantasy fiction that I'm not a big Brandon Sanderson fan, they're all like, I'm sorry. And I don't think he's a bad writer, he's just not right on the team. You have Dragon Sword and Windchild, which is a work of beautiful Japanese fantasy. It's a young adult series, it's great. But it incorporates both cultures sort of equally. We have things like Record Lotus War, which are a D&D transcript turned into a fantasy series. So you can't get much more like, we just took that stuff from England and made it into a Japanese fantasy series, because D&D is Tolkien. Like, that's all it is. Especially the first edition, which is what this is. And then you have things like Morihito, which sort of combines things. And you have people like George R. Martin writing things where the cultural characters are diverse, because the books are. I have not watched the show, but the books have this diversity in them, and they look at characters from all over, and the odes and cultures from all over the world sort of inform the characters. Because that's what gives them depth and flavor, is that mythology and culture and folklore from anywhere in the world, lending credence to the believability and layering of the characters in the world. Right? None of us are going to believe in a world where everybody is the same. Like, maybe you do, I'm sorry, but in general, most of us know that people are different and unique and that there's different cultures out there. And so you would want that to, even that, for real world mythology, informs your writing to some extent. And it informs the world, it gives it depth and layer and flavor. Alright. If you would like to read any more about this, there's some great references. If you want to talk more about how Tolkien screwed up fantasy in a lot of ways, I will also talk to you about that later, not right now. And I have quite deliberately left 5 minutes for discussion and questions. So if anyone has a question or a discussion point, I'd love to hear it. Yes? That's an interesting question, Sharon. This is where I was not clear how it works. If you can see my computer, you know I'm a big fan of fandom. That's a really interesting question, and I don't think there is a difference in a lot of ways. Like they're trying to do the same thing. The difference is that, Meiji Restoration led to imperialist Japan, which was a terrible state. Like they did horrible, awful things. So, I would argue that J.R. Tolkien did was much better. Right? But I think the difference is that it's subtle and it's hard to see what J.R. Tolkien did, right? Like, we're starting to have a reckoning. And people think we're having it, we're starting to have that reckoning. We're not, fully into it yet. So, in one way, it's better because you don't have an imperialist state that fought a war in China, fought the Ryukyu Islands, and all of that horrible stuff that came out of the Meiji Restoration. I also have a whole panel on the history of France and Japan, and they play a lot of role in that. France does, which is really interesting. Not getting it today, sorry. Alright, it's gone. France has a lot to answer for in imperialist Japan, by the way. Because they also went through a lot of great things, so it's also interesting. But I would just argue, like, the effect is different, and sometimes subtle is not necessarily better. If that helps, can I answer the question, sort of? I mean, that's like a whole nother, right? Like, you need like an hour for that conversation too. But I would argue it's not, what he did in some ways is better. Right? But he wasn't state sanctioned. Right? Like, anytime you have a religious state being like, believe this or die, you have problems. Yes. In the girl church. Yeah, I mean, you just always use your imagination. If you're referring to the fact that I talked about like using mythology and stuff, like, yeah, I'm not saying that there's a wrong way to do it. I'm just saying that using mythology helps ground characters, and so it's a good thing to do. I'm not saying there's like a right way or a wrong way. I know there are people out there who do like hate even police how fantasy characters are used, and like that's a problem, and they shouldn't do it. Bad gatekeeper, no cookies. Like, yeah, gatekeeping at any level is just wrong. And people like to do it, and that's really sad. Because it keeps a lot of people from liking really great things. Yeah. Yeah. Huh? No, I'm just thinking about some things that have happened with gatekeeping, and I'm just like, how? Nothing. Yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing too is, right, like, if we don't, a lot of these things we like call it traditional, and I guess it is, so like, we don't know that it's the original way of doing it, right? Like, we talk so much about like the she and the elves in Celtic mythology, and they're Norse. Like, they were, the Vikings, like, raiding and pillaging is what introduced them into Celtic mythology. And like, you can follow the history of that. Like, you know, you just don't know, so I think you can never, like, yes, people want to say, like, there's a traditional way versus a non-traditional way. But traditional doesn't mean better, and traditional doesn't mean original. Like, I think that's sometimes too that, I mean, people in power have decided this is the way it's going to be done. It doesn't mean it's, like, the right or original way. And like I said, like, the she and the like, fairies and elves are a great example of Celtic mythology. And there's like a billion, like Shikigami, right? Like they're not Japanese. They're Japanese now, but like they got introduced through the French to Japan. And Japan was like, thank you, Thomas now. And that's like they're reapers. They didn't have that in their culture, so they were like, yeah.